There was no difference between me and Mad God. And the deeper I got into it, it was more, I was more it than it was me.
The early germination of Mad God influences and inspirations started when I was very young. Ray Harryhausen's The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad.
Well, as an 8-year-old, I had no idea what it was, but it just grabbed me, immediately. I mean, just the spectacle of it from the first second. The Cyclops, running after the magician and, exiting from the great kind of Cyclopean cave. I was hooked. I annoyed my parents to take me to see it, but they ran black and white trailers on TV. And I remember telling my parents, I really like that the characters kind of move like this. And so I was already, before I'd seen the movie, really attracted to that feeling of, it was like a distant otherness that was inexplicable. And I guess it just appealed to my aesthetic. I'd never seen anything like it. And that's what I wanted to do the rest of my life. I always wanted to make things that I had never seen before. At some point, I discovered Forrest J. Ackerman was the editor of a magazine called Famous Monsters of Filmland. And Forey was a friend with Ray Bradbury and Ray Harryhausen, so he would run articles on this stuff. My dad's, I wonder what is this stuff? He said, well, it's like, I think they take a model and it's kind of like a cartoon. And that was the only reference that I had until I read some of the articles in Forey's magazine on Ray. And then it was like, oh, okay, great. And so now I had a compass. It was a real vertical climb, but then I got, really lucky. I always sought out mentors. I started visiting the people up at Cascade Pictures of California. Jim Danforth and Dave Allen is where I met Dennis Muren and a bunch of people, Ken Ralston. And because there were so few people doing this stuff, you can count them on, one hand. And, that was really our, graduate school. It was run by, wonderful couple of guys, Phil Kellison and Joe Rayner, who were, our mentors and really into stop motion and visual effects and all of that stuff, and would let us, work after hours on projects and whatnot. So it was a really wonderful time. And then, of course, from there, it was like Dennis and Ken got jobs on Star Wars, and then one thing led to the next. He didn't have the money he needed to do that show. This is purely anecdotal, but from what I could tell, it looked like, Stewart didn't have enough money to make a lot of space aliens. So there was a bunch of stuff in there that kind of looked like Beatrix Potter type stuff that you might find, hanging on a shelf in the wardrobe department someplace. And so George, wanted more space aliens, and somehow was able to talk Fox out of the money and hired, Rick Baker, who was already on another project, and he put together a bunch of his friends, stop motion animators. So we made, used a lot of Rick's masks, and then Ron Cobb had done a bunch of designs for costumes that we made. And while George would come by weekly and check on our progress and saw a stop motion I made when I was younger, and that gave him the idea to do the chess set. And then, it was like, hey, okay, what's the end of the movie? He was going to do it with humans with masks. And can you make, a dozen space aliens in 2 weeks? And we did, and shot it, and it was like, oh, hey, there's these guys out there that can make a dozen space aliens in 2 weeks that aren't bad, So on Jedi, a bunch of things, he would meet up one week, he'd just make me a bunch of creatures. And so I pulled together, half dozen sculptors, and we'd do different things. And he'd come in and go like, what's this guy? I'd go like, oh, it's a calamari man. And he's like, oh, okay, that's Admiral Akbar. It's a trap. And then, it went on like that. Historic Beast led to a CBS documentary show called Dinosaur. Christopher Reeve narrated it.
They were indomitable. They were the lords of their universe. And every year, almost 1 million people come into the building, the American Museum of Natural History, to look up and to wonder at this and other magnificent animals.
That all led to Jurassic Park. So when Steven was, building that thing up, he was talking to George, and George said, well, you should talk to Phil, because he knows a lot about dinosaurs and knows movies. So, that got me the job. I never was very academic. I wasn't ever academically inclined, so, I would study and, jerry-rig little ways that I could single frame, 8mm versions of Seventh Voyage of Sinbad and study how Ray did his stuff, and got to the point where I realized, okay, so that's what he's doing. And then, after years of, I never really tried to duplicate his approach. I wanted to do something different. I didn't know what that was until I started getting into it a little bit more. So it was a very different kind of more naturalistic style. Ray's style was very much kind of based on cell animation, moving pose to pose to pose. I tried to break that a lot and not do that. I just wanted a different kind of more naturalistic, organic flow to stuff. Mad God was the classic Campbell hero's journey that, it results in the death and rebirth of the hero. It's the through line for the movie, the assassin exists in many, many different forms all throughout the movie. I mean, he is torn apart in surgery and gives birth, and the baby is reduced to its constituent elements that create a new universe, and blah, blah, blah. It literally was a religious experience in terms of how it manifested itself, because it was back in the early to mid 80s. I was orbiting this idea, or it wasn't even an idea yet. It was like the gravitational field was out in the chronosynclastic infinitebula. It just didn't have any. Then gradually, things like, well, this kind of looks like that, and this relates to that. Particles start kind of coming into orbit, and I made it, and it made me, and there was no difference between me and Mad God. And the deeper I got into it, I was more it than it was me. I was just doing what I was told. You hear so many times with, particularly, the ancients, Bach and Mozart, where did Beethoven, where did all this stuff come from? And they just go, it comes from God. I was just transcribing it. I really feel like I have nothing to do with it. And that's the way I do feel, conceptually. But, physically, I felt it quite a bit. It's a different journey than, doing, work for hire, which is all, it has guardrails on it. You know what you're doing, and there's, budget and time and all that stuff. But, left to your own devices, it can really destroy you.